This next section of chapter 22 and 23 puts a rather grisly end to the Mr. Collins proposal section. Charlotte Lucas, who is friends with Elizabeth, they've grown up together, they're neighbors. Lady Lucas and Lord Lucas are themselves wealthy by mercantilism. They've traded and bought and sold things. They've been friends for as long as Elizabeth can remember, and she's always admired Charlotte. But Charlotte has designs on Mr. Collins the second she hears that Collins has been rejected by Elizabeth. And as it says here in the text, Collins becomes aware of this and sneaks off to the Lucas's house. Charlotte's kindness extended farther than Elizabeth had any conception of. Its object was nothing else than to secure her from any return of Mr. Collins's addresses by engaging them towards herself. Such was Miss Lucas's scheme, and appearances were so favorable that when they parted at night she would have felt almost sure of success if he had not been to leave Hertfordshire so very soon. But here she did injustice to the fire and independence of his character, for it led him to escape out of Longbourn House the next morning with admirable slyness, and hasten to Lucas Lodge to throw himself at her feet. He was anxious to avoid the notice of his cousins, from a conviction that if they saw him depart, they could not fail to conjecture his design, and he was not willing to have the attempt known till its success might be known likewise. For though feeling almost secure, and with reason, for Charlotte had been tolerably encouraging, he was comparatively diffident since the adventure of Wednesday. His reception, however, was of the most flattering kind. Miss Lucas perceived him from an upper window as he walked towards the house, and instantly set out to meet him, accidentally, in the lane. But little had she dared to hope that so much love and eloquence awaited her there. It says a great deal about Collins' character, first off, that he is actually rather desperate to get married. No woman will have him, because he's such a clod. That he actually jumps at the chance to get married to Charlotte Lucas when she shows just the smallest amount of encouragement. Tolerably encouraging, it says. He was comparatively diffident after his adventure on Wednesday. That is, after being rejected by Elizabeth, he feels a little bit like, I need to find somebody to get married to. Consequently, he throws himself at her feet. He grovels before her, basically, and takes whatever he can get. This is not a question of love or a question of happiness. It's a question of wounded pride, and himself wanting to have his wounded pride assuaged by having somebody get married to him. Well, as it says here in the text, as they entered the house, he earnestly entreated her to name the day that was to make him the happiest of men. And though such a solicitation must be waived for the present, the lady felt no inclination to trifle with his happiness. The stupidity with which he was favored by nature must guard his courtship from any charm that can make a woman wish for its continuance. Collins is very eager to get married, and Charlotte is very eager to get married too. And so why not get married? The two of them gravitate towards one another very, very quickly. There's almost no acquaintance before this. They don't know each other hardly at all. And yet, very quickly, they move towards marriage. That says a lot about the desperation of Collins. But notice also what Charlotte is doing. She's pulling the rug out from under Elizabeth to a degree. That's not totally out of character with Charlotte. As we see earlier, way back at the beginning of the novel, Charlotte has expressed certain opinions about marriage which are actually antithetical towards Elizabeth's opinions. We go back for a minute, all the way back to chapter 6. The text says the following: Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. If the dispositions of the parties are ever so well known to each other, or ever so similar beforehand, it does not advance their felicity in the least. They always continue to grow sufficiently unlike afterwards to have their share of vexation, and it is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life. You make me laugh, Charlotte, said Elizabeth, but it is not sound. You know it is not sound, and that you would never act in this way yourself. Charlotte has already expressed way back in chapter 6 that marriage is pure chance. There's no thought in it. You just find somebody, you get married to them, and hopefully you have a tolerable amount of happiness. But it's better, she says, in some ways not to know the person before you get married to them, lest you be very disappointed afterwards. If, for instance, you don't know the person before you marry them, then there's a great chance that, you'll be at least tolerably happy. It's a very kind of paltry, gray, thin vision of happiness. The ideal of marriage is that two people will see in one another goodness of character, nobility, honor, virtue, gravitate towards one another, and thus fulfill their happiness by being intimate friends first and foremost. Something I think which Jane Austen recognizes and many people miss in the very nature of marriage. Marriage is as a Catholic Church says, a sacrament that continues throughout the rest of one's life. Why? Primarily because a good marriage is based upon real friendship, and that friendship grows as the people grow together. Because both people are introspective, self-critical, they are enlightened, that is. They try constantly to move beyond the prejudices that they have, to improve themselves, to work as a team so that they don't get involved in the failings and problems and myopic thinking of the world. But Charlotte doesn't think that. And as a foil to Elizabeth, she shows how much Elizabeth has changed even from Book 6 to where she is currently with Mr. Collins. Charlotte still thinks that marriage is about convenience, and that you can't expect happiness or much goodness out of marriage. Elizabeth originally thought, you're so funny, you don't really think that way, because Elizabeth doesn't think that way. But Charlotte does, and we see that to be the case in this chapter. As it says here, Charlotte accepted Collins solely from the pure and disinterested desire of an establishment. She cared not how soon that establishment were gained. Further on in the text, when Charlotte actually comes to visit Elizabeth, there's an exchange between the two, which Elizabeth is shocked to find out that she's engaged to Mr. Collins. And the two of them have a falling out as friends because Elizabeth realizes how different she has become from Charlotte. This is what it says in the text. Miss Lucas called soon after breakfast and in a private conference with Elizabeth related the event of the day before. The possibility of Mr. Collins's fancying himself in love with her friend had once occurred to Elizabeth within the last day or two, but that Charlotte could encourage him seemed almost as far from possibility as she could encourage him herself. And her astonishment was consequently so great as to overcome at first the bounds of decorum, and she could not help crying out, "Engaged to Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, impossible!" The steady countenance which Miss Lucas had commanded in telling her story gave way to a momentary confusion here on receiving so direct a reproach. Though, as it was no more than she expected, she soon regained her composure and calmly replied, "Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion, because he was not so happy as to succeed with you?" Here Elizabeth has noticed with Collins that she's dealing with a fool. The man is a fool. He's a clod. He's an idiot. He's shallow. He's base. And he would not make somebody happy. Not even Charlotte. Elizabeth knows that he wouldn't make Charlotte happy. But Elizabeth thinks that happiness and marriage are intimately connected. Consequently, she's already changing. She's evolving. She is herself becoming more enlightened and separate from the opinions of the rest of her community. Charlotte is still in the opinion that marriage is merely convenience. There's no such thing as happiness involved in it. And she even says the following to Elizabeth, "I'm not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connection, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." Jane Austen is wonderful in her subtlety because she doesn't come right out and talk about damnation or salvation. That's not her idiom. What she does do is she hints at such things. She hints at such things through the nature primarily of marriage. Marriage is for her in some ways a vehicle by which she talks about these issues of honesty and honor and salvation and enlightenment. And in this instance, she gives us an example through Charlotte of somebody who is headed for sorrow, headed for misery, headed to some degree towards damnation. Though with Jane Austen, we're not talking pitchforks and demons and fire and things like that. We're talking the damnation of living the rest of her life miserable with somebody who's not her friend, like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, who their entire life is lived biting each other, fighting with one another, making fun of one another. That's a miserable relationship to be in. And Charlotte asks only for a pleasant, comfortable home. And if that's all she wants out of marriage, that's all she'll get. She won't be happy. She won't have a friend. She won't have a partner that will help her defend against the world. But she will have a comfortable home. And Elizabeth, in seeing this, is appalled. Not just because Collins is a clod, but because her friend has stooped, she thinks, so low, to fall to the state where she's only looking for material gain. That's why at the end of this chapter, her critique is so severe of Charlotte. It says, "The strangeness of Mr. Collins's making 2 offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison of his being now accepted. She had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she had not supposed it to be possible that when called into action she would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins, was a most humiliating picture, and to the pang of a friend disgracing herself and sunk in her esteem was added the distressing conviction that it was impossible for that friend to be tolerably happy in the lot she had chosen." Well, that very falling out between Elizabeth and Charlotte, on the one hand, makes a rift between them which is unhealable. They cannot stay friends. And it says further on in the text that there was a restraint between them when they meet again. It keeps them mutually silent on the subject. And because of this one issue, the two of them see that they can never subsist in confidence with one another again. It also creates in Elizabeth a new vision of what marriage ought to be. Marriage is not, in Elizabeth's mind now, simply for convenience. It is not for material gain. It can't be, lest she ends up miserable and unhappy. For Elizabeth, in her conception of the world and her conception of future happiness, marriage has to be something more. It has to be more than simply material gain. And whether it's going to be more than simply being flattered or not, we'll see in the future chapters. But as of now, it seems like Elizabeth is gravitating away from the idea that marriage is purely convenience or purely for her own gratification. Marriage is rather finding somebody you can trust, somebody who is noble and honorable and stalwart. Guess who that is?